Well, what I learned about Jackson in the context of the court fight is just how much Roosevelt really trusted Jackson's advice. Jackson was not a major player in this conflict, but he's present, and he's got a significant role at the Justice Department, obviously, during this period. But more importantly, he's got a relationship that goes way back with Franklin Roosevelt. And so he finds himself almost Zelig-like in the Oval Office at key moments. He's there in the Oval Office when Roosevelt gets the call from Don Richburg over at the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court has just overturned the NRA and the Schechter decision. Jackson is there with him in the Oval Office in that moment, which he writes about in his memoir, In That Man. And so Jackson's in a position, whenever asked or whenever there, to offer Roosevelt advice on these sorts of questions. And while he was not driving certainly Roosevelt's policy in this area, he has nothing to do with the court packing plan. He is there for Roosevelt to reach out to at key moments. And I think the most important advice that Jackson gives Roosevelt in this regard during this period happens right after the launch of the court fight, when Jackson in February 1937 comes back to Jamestown and spends some time talking to folks in town who he expects would be the president's natural supporters on the court plan, and he finds that the folks in Jamestown are, in Jackson's words, baffled by the court plan, that the president hasn't done enough to prepare them for what he wanted to do with the Supreme Court, and he's not doing enough to persuade them. And so Jackson writes a very frank letter to FDR, and I spent a lot of time in FDR's correspondence, and I'll tell you, Roosevelt, particularly in February 1937, really didn't receive anything like this. It was just a very frank letter to the president that Jackson composes when he goes back to Washington and says, I've spent some time among the plain people, as Jackson puts it, and he says, your argument isn't convincing anybody, and you're actually losing ground instead of gaining ground. And he pushes the president to be very direct about his purposes in packing the court, to really take on the court, rather than to do it by indirection as Roosevelt did and pretend that the whole thing is a matter of judicial efficiency, to say this is about ideology, this is about a conservative Supreme Court that is standing in the way of the New Deal. You should tell people that. And Roosevelt finally says, you know what, that's a good idea. And there's an Oval Office meeting that follows that letter very shortly, where Jackson and Reed are visiting with the president, and they continue on this line, and Roosevelt yields almost immediately and says, you're right. I've wasted a few weeks pursuing this other rationale. I've got to be straight with the people about it. And Roosevelt begins work on two very important speeches in March of 1937 that really lay out the case as Jackson thought that he should.
Well, let me back up. The Struggle for Judicial Supremacy book, which came out 1941. Why did Jackson feel compelled to write that book? Was that part of that experience?
Well, he certainly. I'll just take a step back to Jackson's role in the remainder of the court fight. There were a couple of key points where Jackson made strong public statements on behalf of the court packing plan. He was no great fan of court packing itself. It is probably not what Jackson would have chosen to do, but he did believe that the court needed to act with restraint. This was a common theme of Jackson's, which he develops very fully in Struggle for Judicial Supremacy, and you can see it in his work on the Supreme Court, obviously. But Jackson, again, acting on his own advice, felt that he needed to make the case directly for the president's purposes. And Homer Cummings, when the Senate Judiciary Committee held hearings on the court packing bill beginning in March 1937, and the first witness that they called on behalf of the administration was Homer Cummings, the Attorney General. And Cummings gave a very smooth presentation, but he argued almost entirely on the grounds that the court was inefficient and needed help with its work, and so therefore it needed new justices. And this case had been battered for a month, and it was rather remarkable to many people that Cummings was willing to make that argument again. Jackson tried to correct the error a day later when he gave testimony, and he made the case as he urged Roosevelt to make it, and indeed as Roosevelt himself had begun to make it, which is to say that this was a conservative court that was out of step with the will of the people, that it was acting on not constitutional grounds, but on the basis of its own economic predilections, and that it needed to step back and allow the will of the people to assert itself through this legislation, which in his view was perfectly constitutional. And so the general view was that Jackson gave the most effective presentation on behalf of the court bill, and he won a lot of praise for it, even from those who didn't support the court bill. It was such a masterful, lawyerly, clean presentation, in contrast to Cummings' smooth and sort of disingenuous presentation. So that was an important contribution that Jackson himself made to the president's case over the course of that. He also gave a speech at a couple of speeches in late March in which he suggested that there would be greater labor strife in the country if the court was going to stand in the way of the Wagner Labor Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and saw this as, again, a justification to pass the president's plan. So Jackson became an important public advocate for the plan, even if it was limited essentially to those couple of appearances. He was very helpful to the president in that way. He did go to some pains to make clear to people that he was not, as had been reported, a member of the president's team that plotted strategy. He was often, there was a group that was informally known as the President's Strategy Board, which was being run during the court fight by the president's son, James Roosevelt, and consisted of Tommy Corcoran and a few other individuals. And it was often reported that Robert Jackson was on the strategy board, and there was some confusion about that. And Jackson wanted it known that he was not actually in this little group who's organizing the political strategy for passing the bill. But he was involved, and I think there was some question in subsequent years, not only on Frankfurter's part, but on others' part, whether there would be a taint associated with this, since after all it was a failed undertaking. At the same time, many people had come to feel by that point that it was a successful undertaking. Roosevelt always said in later years, we lost the battle, but we won the war. He'd lost the battle to pack the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court had changed. The switch in time that saved 9. Suddenly the Supreme Court that had been striking down all the New Deal programs was now upholding the New Deal programs. And he and others around him, and I can't speak to Jackson's personal view on this, but I think a good many of Roosevelt's members of Roosevelt's inner circle believed that Roosevelt had essentially forced the change. He had put enough pressure on the court that Owen Roberts, the swing justice, had swung. And I'd be surprised if Jackson himself wasn't of that view, particularly given what he wrote in The Struggle.
Do you get a sense that Jackson at that time was positioning himself to be a justice of the Supreme Court?
I think that it was certainly in the air. In fact, it was not only in the air, but it was in the press. At the beginning of the court, it's hard for us to see this because the court plan was such a spectacular failure that it does seem, looking back, that the handwriting was on the wall from the beginning. In fact, as I try to make clear in Supreme Power, it seemed to most observers at the beginning, and actually for some time after that Roosevelt ultimately would win. He would win ugly, but he would get what he wanted. And so there was speculation from the very beginning, beginning in February 1937, who's Roosevelt going to name? He's not only going to get to name 1 new justice, he's going to get to name 6 new justices. And so who are they? And a lot of names were floated, and one of the remarkable ironies of all this is that a good number of these folks actually wound up being named to the court, not in the wake of court packing, but over the succeeding years. So Jackson's name was mentioned in the papers as one possibility. Felix Frankfurter, William Douglas, and a number of others who didn't actually wind up on the court in the end. But Jackson's name was in the air, and I'm sure this was not outside the reach of his ambitions. And I think that this was another area where Jackson was demonstrating his shrewd legal judgment and also his service to the president.